became aware of J.P. Guilford as an undergraduate. My professor, Walter Webb, of psychology, had gone to the APA conference and had heard JP, and he came back and he was all excited. And he told us about how JP had talked about the disconnect between education and creative productivity. And he also talked about how JP had said that we need to develop the creativity of children and youth, and to also nurture the creative personality. And so then he gave us an assignment, and the assignment was to identify a creative individual that we thought that manifested a lot of the characteristics that J.P. Guilford had talked about in his APA presentation. And I chose Shel Silverstein. Shel was a distinguished lecturer at the University of Mount Union College, and I asked him if I could use him as my subject and ask him some questions, and he said, sure, let's have breakfast. And he told me that he was a dreamer, that he was not a favorite of his teachers because he asked so many questions, and he also said that he had a tremendous love of nature. And he identified a mentor who was Nordstrom, who was an editor. And she said, you should write children's books. Well, he'd never thought about that. And so he wrote The Giving Tree, which is a phenomenal story. And it's been translated into about 20 different languages. And so after I graduated from the University of Mount Union, which used to be Mount Union College, I went to California and taught gifted kids in Garden Grove, California, with this really super mentor, Jean Delp, who had identified a program for the state that focused on creativity and gifted kids. Jane was one of these people that said, everybody needs to go to graduate school and you all need to be certified. So I went on to California Coast University and worked on a master's degree. There I met Juliana Gensley, who was one of the original Terman participants. And for those of you that might not be familiar with Terman's work, it was his dissertation. He identified over 1,000 students at age 7, and he followed them all the way through their life. And so whenever they would have their yearly reunions, Juliana would take her class, and we would watch these people who were probably in their late 40s interacting with one another like they were 9 or 10 years old. And it was that motivation and interaction that continued to help them be creative and productive. And Juliana looked at me and she said, one day you need to go on for your doctorate. Let me introduce you to May Segal, who happened to be another Terman participant. So when I met May at UCLA, she said, you know, the thing that I really feel so concerned about that JP talked about was opportunity, that so many of the minority and culturally diverse students don't have the opportunity to develop their creativity. And I said, wow, I would love to use that as my dissertation. And she said, great, go over to the University of Southern California and ask J.P. Guilford if you can use his creativity test, alternative uses, and that can be your pre and your post test. So I made a call to USC and asked JP if I could see him, and he said, sure, come on in. And I told him that I was going to be working with 4th grade, and he told me he had taught 4th grade in Nebraska. And I said that part of what I was going to do was to introduce creative skills to the students using what I called encounter lessons. And the encounter lessons really deal with 5 different kinds of questions. The first question I told him was a sensory one, where you ask them to become an inanimate object and then ask them, what are you seeing, feeling, hearing? And there's no wrong answers. Every answer is acceptable. And you work with a small group of 5 so that the students are listening to one another as well as they're listening to themselves. The second question in that series deals with creativity. You say, well, look at yourself as a rock, and how could you be more interesting? And so the students are able to add a little mica or whatever it is to make themselves more creative. The third question has to do with how you interact with other people. And so I say to them, look, somebody is dumping a whole box of rocks into our stream. What do you think about that? And so again, some of the students go, I'm going to hide. Others go, I'm looking for new friends. And so you see the individual response that a child makes. And then the fourth one deals with risk taking. And I said the question might be, there's a group of boys coming and they're going to skip rocks across the stream. How do you feel about that? And then the last question is the one that is really the profound one. That's where you ask the students to give you a abstract synthesis. And so you say, you know, you've been a rock. You're an old rock. You've been in the stream for a long time. If you could talk, what might you say to people? And so they, again, pull all of that together. And JP said, oh, that sounds really interesting. And I would love to work with you. Who's your major professor? And I said, May Seago. And he looked at me and he said, you're not one of our students? And I said, no, sir, I'm a dissertation seeker from UCLA. He said, that's okay, I'll still help you. And so he reached into his desk, he got a copy of his alternative uses and handed it to me. And over the next 2 years, I probably spent more time with JP than I did with May Seago. I would take him videos of the kids so that he could see how they interacted with one another. And Fritz Perls was an adjunct professor at UCLA, and he really impacted my thinking about a statement that he made. He said, no matter what you're talking about, you're really talking about yourself. And so as the students would do these little encounter lessons, they would hear themselves, of course, but they would also hear others. And so when we got through with the test using the pre and post test, it was significant at the 0.01 level. But the part that was most interesting to JP was the fact that the students were taking the creative skills that they had done in the encounter lessons, and they were using those in the regular classroom. Teachers said they were asking more questions, that they were really being more creative. And so as I shared that with him, he said, you know, I had a call from the University of South Florida. They're looking for a professor to teach gifted. And I was wondering if you were interested, because they want somebody that's really interested in creativity. And I said, yes. And so he called and made the recommendation, and I joined the University of South Florida in 1966 and stayed there until I went on to Washington, DC. But one of the things that was interesting for me is because I've been so involved with JP and his structure of the intellect, is I developed a Saturday program for students, and we had our graduate students develop lessons based on the structure of the intellect. About that same time, I met one of his doctoral students, Mary Meeker, and Mary took the SI, which is JP Guilford, and she added curriculum and identification and she called it the structure of intellect. And I don't know if you can see that, if I get really close, there. This is the structure of the intellect that JP has, and we use the content section to develop the lessons. And when he visited us, the teacher said, we think in SOI, whenever we are developing lessons, we think that's a convergent, that's a divergent, that's an evaluation. And so that he was really amazed about that. One of the things that we did notice while we were working with JP and his SI theory is how closely it was just very close to the Creative Education Foundation's work at that time, because they were talking about brainstorming and coming up with as many ideas as possible. His alternative uses was that, where you take a object and think of as many uses that you can of that. And then the 5-step model that Sid Parnes came up with is very similar to some of JP's work. So the Creative Education Foundation holds the Creative Problem Solving Institute, they call it CPSI, every year. And so early in, I think JP's was barely 80, he came to one in Buffalo, and we had family groupings where we would have the different people that were interested in a topic get together, and I was chairing one of them. And I had John Gowan in the group. I had Sid Parnes in the group, Dean Patton, George Ainsworth Land, and Joseph Katina was there. And so as the chair, I said, if you were thinking about yourself next year, what would be something that you would be wanting to think about? And JP said, I want to write a book on the creative personality. The rest of us just sort of looked and went, wow, here's this person, early 80s, still productive, still dynamic. And George Ainsworth Len was looking at him, and he said, that's absolutely amazing about the creative personality. And JP replied, I think creativity is irrational. He said, I've really been thinking about that. At which point, George Ainsworth Len pointed out that many of the artists that he had worked with intuitively identified the materials that they were going to use. And then Doris Shellcross said, well, intuition is an inner way of knowing. And at that point, Sid Parnes said, my problem with all of this mindful activities is my to-do list keeps coming up. And so Dean Patton said, I've got a solution for that. He said, let's do a visualization. And so he had all of us close our eyes and think that every cell in our body had light. And so as you have all this light in your body, you feel light yourself. And so there's a light at your navel, and you take that navel light and you stream it up to the right and stream it up to the left and down at the bottom until you're fully centered and feeling very, very light and very calm and very relaxed. And then he said, at your leisure, open your eyes and come back. And so we all looked at one another, and it was absolutely amazing to see the interaction that was going on at that point as we talked. And so JP talked about how he wanted to take the structure of the intellect, and he was going to add, particularly since we'd done the visualization, he wanted to add visual recording and visual memory to the structure of the intellect. And then he said, of course, I want to do my creative personality book. And he did. He published it with the Creative Education Foundation the very next year. So when I look at JP's life, which was just so amazing, I think his primary achievement was that he began to open our eyes that there's another way of looking at ability, that it's not a general ability, it has multiple abilities. And so it was a forerunner for what Howard Gardner did with his multiple talents that he came up with. And then, of course, with Carol Dweck with her growth mindset. On his desk, he had a little plaque, and it said, intelligence teaching is intelligence teaching. And that's how I remember him. And I thank you so much for this